Appreciate everybody coming today. I'm David Bergeron. I'm currently the Vice President for Postsecondary Education Policy at the Center for American Progress. Center for American Progress is a think tank in Washington, D.C., which works on a variety of issues that relate to growing the middle class and eliminating economic inequality in the United States. And it's been around for about 11 years. I joined them about 18 months ago, having spent the bulk of my career, really all of my career, at the U.S. Department of Education. In my last position, I was acting assistant secretary for post-secondary education and deputy assistant secretary for policy planning and innovation in the Office of Post-Secondary Education. So I spent a lot of time working on higher education issues in the executive branch. And one of the great things about that was that I got to spend some time with some really wonderful people, some of whom were in this room and some of whom were on this panel. And so I appreciate the opportunity also to be back in New England. I grew up just down the road in Rhode Island. I went to University of Rhode Island and have enjoyed being back in New England a couple times recently. We will not talk about what high school reunion I was here for. It's a very sad thing. I'm going to introduce our panelists really very briefly. Don't want to spend a lot of time on introductions because I want to spend a lot of time engaged in conversation about various roles related to and perspectives related to accreditation and authorization of programs that are doing competence-based education. I'm going to go from my left, your right, down the panel. David Sue is the Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of the Undersecretary at the U.S. Department of Education. His work focuses on a broad array of higher education issues with particular emphasis on academic quality and innovation. David earned his bachelor's degree and master's degree here in Boston at Boston College. He then earned a PhD in higher education at University of Pennsylvania, and he's been with the department since 2011. Barbara Brittingham, you all know very well because she is the president of the Commission on Institutions of Higher Education at NEASC. In her role, Barbara oversees and ensures effectiveness of 235 colleges and universities in New England and in 9 institutions abroad. Prior to coming to NEASC, Barbara was the founding dean at the College of Education at Zayed University. And from my perspective, the more interesting thing is that she was the dean of the College of Human Science and Service at the University of Rhode Island, where I was an undergraduate and proudly of that fact. Michael Milligan is the executive director of ABET, which accredits 3,300 colleges, universities, and disciplines of applied science, computing, engineering, and engineering technology in 23 countries. Prior to joining ABET, Michael worked for the Aerospace Corporation, developing a new generation of environmental satellites for NOAA. He also served for 24 years in the United States Air Force, working in areas of operations, international research and development, and technology acquisition. Michael holds a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, and Masters of Science and Engineering from the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, and a BS from Michigan State. So we're really, as you can tell, we have a great panel to be here talking about accreditation and its relationship with competency-based learning. Let me begin with a few observations from my time at the department and my time since. And the first observation I make is that higher education in the United States is change-averse. We like things the way they are. And in reality, we all are this way. It's not just our higher education system. We're in New England, after all. We like things to remain kind of as they were. And So it takes some, some remarkable ideas to come to the fore for folks to really want to pursue innovation, and so I think it's interesting to me to see that innovation playing out, based on the conversations you heard already this morning and the ones as they will continue in the afternoon. I am sure you'll hear a lot about the folks doing some really very creative things and important things. The current system of using credit hours to determine learning, and it's been around for 100 years. We've been counting credit hours for 100 years because we know how to do that. We know how to structure educational programs around that framework, and our structures of our educational systems are really even older than that. They go back to the very founding of the country and before. And so people like the way our higher education system is and are resistant to change. As institutions have implemented alternatives, though, they've realized that things like credit hours just don't work the way we want them to. They've been made to fit a problem rather than being designed to solve a specific problem as they were originally. And so we've stayed very cautiously, very deliberately in the safety of the structures and the processes that we all are familiar with. And then along the way, some things really started to change. We moved to a place where a lot of institutions began to provide training and education in online formats. And in 2002, Congress gave us the authority to not use credit hours and clock hours as a way to measure learning, but gave authority to the department to award federal financial aid based on direct assessment, something called direct assessment, and they did that in response to developments in competency-based learning, championed by places like Western Governors University and Capella University, where they were exploring models that walked back from using credit hours as a way to measure learning. And it really, from 2002 to 2012, really nothing happened in that regard. No institution came forward, raised their hand and said, we're going to get rid of the credit hour. We're going to rely on on direct assessment as the way we're going to award credit and award financial aid. And then College for America came forward with support from and approval from NEASC to ask the department to allow them to participate in the federal aid programs using direct assessment as the way that they would award financial aid. And based on lessons learned from that, we issued a Dear Colleague letter while still at the department that encouraged institutions to submit proposals or submit applications and kind of tried to address many of the questions that had arisen as the department was in the business of approving and reviewing the College for America's proposal. So that's kind of the framework for what I observed when I was at the department as it relates to competency-based learning and direct assessment. Most institutions delivered and continue to deliver their competency-based programs, and there are many that do. Within the context of courses and for credit. Now we're in an era where there are a lot more folks who want to try different things. And with that, I want to start by asking David Sue to talk a bit about the role the Department of Education plays in promoting or discouraging the adoption of new approaches to measure learning outcomes.
Thanks, David. And again, thanks for having me here today. I'm really happy to be back in Boston and back in New England. I think I'll probably start and just back up a little bit about where the context that all of this is in. I know Allison Cadlick downstairs mentioned that institutions all and different actors operate within their context. And the department, we've talked a lot for the last year about college opportunity. And so we started off the year with a College Opportunity Summit that the President and First Lady hosted. And it was really finding new ways to open up opportunity to all students. And so the innovation agenda that's really gotten a kick into high gear this year is really placed squarely within that opportunity agenda. I think often we look at it, people look at innovation and the new things that we're doing in isolation and don't look at it as part of that bigger policy. But we really do see it as ways to serve existing students better, ways to serve new populations of students. And so all of the things that we're doing in competency-based education and the other innovative practices are really part of that. Some of the other things that we're doing are our First in the World grants we just announced last month, sorry. It all very, very recently. But $75 million to 24 institutions that are doing some really great things, including Southern New Hampshire, Bay Path here in the area, and Northeastern, a couple of others. So really some good work. Some of those, I know the one at Southern New Hampshire is going to support remedial work in competency-based education. So we're really excited about seeing all of those things. We have some experimental sites that we're doing. So the first one is funding. The second is allowing us to waive regulations and statutes that'll encourage innovation. And we're also doing a lot of convening and bringing groups together at the department and around the country to focus on innovation. So we really see all of these various tools and levers that we have as encouraging conversation about innovation, about learning outcomes, and moving and helping the field advance itself. And so our new Undersecretary, Ted Mitchell, is very much interested in seeing innovation fostered. It's really his background. He's come both from academia and also Silicon Valley. He really gets innovation deeply. And so he's challenged those of us at the department to really look at ways that we can support innovation. And he's talked about a couple of different the theory of change for our innovation. So it starts sort of on the ground with innovation, people doing innovations at places across the country, and then taking those things that seem to be showing some promise and doing really rigorous evaluation. So evaluation, then scaling up those things that are working well, and then laying the groundwork for policy change. And obviously there's a little bit of blurring, you do a little bit of policy change along the way, but that's sort of the rough outlines of how it can go. And so we really see the competency-based education movement happening at schools across the country is really that the first and second parts of that theory of change, of really innovating, of trying new things and evaluating them and seeing how they work. And so we're trying to do as much as we can through our funding, through our regulatory flexibility, and through our convening to lay the groundwork for that. And I think also conversations with accreditors and others. I'll probably leave it there.
So when an institution wants to begin to offer competency-based programs, one of the things that they have to do in order to use federal financial aid funds for that purpose is they have to come to the department and seek approval for that. Could you talk a minute about that approval process from the department's perspective and how that works? And also, you might want to one of the things that has happened in the last couple of weeks is that the department's inspector general has conducted a review of the process used to approve competency-based programs, direct assessment programs, and does that change or alter the way in which that process is being done? And then we'll talk some of those specific things that they raised later in the conversation.
Sure. So for those institutions that want to participate in a direct assessment program, they first, as David said, have to get approval from their accrediting agency, and then there's a process to work with the department. and this was the subject of an Inspector General report recently. And I think it's important, as you noted, sort of the context here is this is a very new process. We've only had a handful of schools that have gone through the process, and as with any new process, it takes a little while to work out how it's going to unfold. And so the department has a committee that has various agency, different parts of the department. So we have our Office of Post-Secondary Education, Federal Student Aid, some of the various programs at the department to look at those approvals and or the applications. And as with any new process, it takes a little time to work out how it's going to go. But we think that we have a good one in place, and the Inspector General noted a few areas where we probably could do things a little bit better. There were already things underway to change when we got that report, and I think that we've implemented a couple of those changes already. But we do think that we have a very good process in place, and it's really an iterative process. It's not as if we work with the institutions as they have submitted their applications, and we'll go back and forth with institutions. So it's not one day they get one thing in the mail. We really have a lot of back and forth. I think sometimes the problem is that it takes a little bit too long and there's a little bit too much back and forth, and we're mindful of the amount of time it's taken. But we're hopeful that as we do more direct assessment applications, that time will come down, and we'll be able to process them more quickly. I think we've learned a couple of things in over the time that we've approved the couple. So there's a few very challenging areas that we've had to look at, and I think that we collectively, the department and the accreditors, are learning about those. The areas of student and faculty interaction, regular and substantive interaction, how to look at credit hour to direct assessment conversion. Those are all really challenging areas that we've learned a lot from. I think the institutions have learned a lot from. I think that the accrediting agencies have. And hopefully over the coming weeks, months, as we all move forward together, we're informing one another and really having that dialogue. I was saying to David that I thought that the first panel made it seem as if the accreditors in the department never talk to one another. And I think we've been trying to have improved dialogue and improved communication, and we're hopeful that through the direct assessment process, through our experimental sites, we'll be able to learn from one another and work together.
So, Barbara, you know that I've often said that real change in higher education would not come from New England. And then you and Paul LeBlanc had to prove me wrong. And I always was amused by the fact that of course Barbara would find a way to prove me wrong, and I actually am very glad that they did. It was. I know it was. And I think that one of the things that I'm aware of is the fact that as an accreditor, you really have worked very hard to find ways to promote reforms that improve practice in New England, and so I'm really not surprised at all that you seize the opportunity to work with Paul and the College for America to develop and approve a competency-based learning program that works through direct assessment. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that process of working through to develop and implement something that radically is changing the way that College for America delivers education in comparison to what had been the case at the University of Southern New Hampshire. And so I was wondering if you'd take a few minutes and talk about that whole process, and that ultimately led to that approval of a direct assessment program.
Thank you. First of all, the commission, as you noted, accredits about 235 colleges and universities in New England, and they range already from, I always like to start with the Naval War College and the seminaries as kind of data points here, and research universities, community colleges, arts colleges, all kinds of different institutions. So the way the standards have to be written for that range of institutions, there has to be room in there for innovation and creativity. And I think there's some current and former commissioners in the room here, and what we hear from them consistently is one of the things they value most from their experience and their hard work on the commission is that they get to see the constant innovation of the colleges and universities in New England, and it goes on all the time, and it's always very rewarding. With respect to College for America, it was a really interesting process to work with. I had the chance to visit Southern New Hampshire a few weeks before their proposal came in, and one of our corporate mottos is we read a draft of everything. So we had an opportunity to look at a draft report and make sure that it was speaking to the commission. But I think the commission found the proposal absolutely fascinating, and there were several reasons that they cited in making the decision to approve it. First of all, it was a very well-written proposal. Also, Southern New Hampshire had just had its comprehensive evaluation about a year or so before that, so the commission had a chance to do a top-to-bottom look at it. And of course, now, thanks to our friends in the federal government, that opportunity included making sure that they were following the department's and the commission's policy on the credit hour. So that there was a basis right there. One of the things that the proposal did was to demonstrate the equivalency of the associate degree, the 120 competency associate degree, to their 60 credit associate degree, and do a little crosswalk so the commission could see where that came from. And I think, despite all the bashing that the credit hour has given us, in some ways, I think academics who worked at credit granting institutions develop almost a hardwired capacity to think about how big a credit hour really is. So that was very helpful. Credit hours also give us the size. A 4-credit course is more than a 3-credit course, and they give us levels of 300-level courses, bigger, faster, taller, smarter, more durable than a 100-level course. So that was all very helpful there. One of the things the commission looks for in any substantive change, to use a term of art, is that the institution has the capacity to carry it out. And the fact that Southern New Hampshire had a significant grant and had hired some very, very smart and talented people to work on this, one of whom is Kate Kasem, who you're going to hear from later today, and brought a lot of talent to doing something that really was new and different, not only for Southern New Hampshire, but I think in many ways for anywhere. The fact that Southern New Hampshire had taken this to the faculty, the on-campus faculty, and they had had a chance to look it over, provided some level of comfort. The fact that they were going to hire experienced graders and had rubrics for the assessment was important, and the fact that they had business partners who provided some level of almost admissions criteria for the students, in the sense that these employers were essentially saying, these potential students are people who are good employees. They're responsible, they show up, they contribute, and we think they're worthy of an investment, whether that was a financial investment or just an endorsement, I think was also gave the commission confidence.
So what, as David indicated in his comments around the Inspector General's report, one of the issues that the Inspector General raised, it was concerned about the communication between the accreditor and the department. And I think it's important for folks to know what your experiences were in those conversations, and how would you like to see that change?
Well, first of all, I was saying to David before the session started that it was nice that in the first session that the bureaucrats and the accreditors were sort of pre-beaten up in the first session, so we don't have to maybe spend quite so much time on that here. But we knew that Southern New Hampshire was going to take this program to the department for approval for direct assessment, and we knew that the department was going to be looking for our letter. So the letter is really no different than the usual letter that we write, but we did write it with the department as an audience in mind, to be as explicit as possible about what the commission saw in that letter that gave it confidence to approve that. We did not hear from the department during the process, and I'm assuming that's because the letter was so well written. But I should say, though, that with David here, that the regional accreditors, we all met in Boston last month, And David and some colleagues came up and talked with us about how we can work together with the experimental side. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I will say I was at the department when the letter from you all came in, and it was very clear in my view that the letter was written with the department as an audience. I have seen other approval letters from other regional accreditors which did not include nearly as much detail, and I do think that played a role, and it also plays a role into what happens later, right? That the precedent was that we got a letter from NIAS that was very explicit about what they saw in the proposal and how the proposal was constructed, and didn't engage in a conversation. I think that influences what happens later. Sometimes that there's maybe not a conversation when there should be, when there isn't that kind of detail. I want to come back and talk about the issue of credit hour equivalency in a minute, but before I do that, I wanted to give Michael a chance to get in the conversation as somebody who leads a specialized accreditor that hasn't been faced yet with the challenge of approving or reviewing a competency-based program. I was wondering, what would your commission's approach be if it were presented with a competency-based program? Because I almost certainly think that in the areas that you accredit, that it's inevitable that one or more of your institutions and one or more of their programs will come forward and want to change the way that they deliver their program.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, David, for the introduction and the question. And what I'd like to do first is just give a quick 45-minute. Got everybody there, didn't I? 45-second tutorial on who ABET is and why we're a bit different than the New England Association. So ABET's a specialized accreditor. There's about 60 of them in the United States, and we're focused purely on specific disciplines and programs. And in our area, we're interested in some applied sciences, computing, engineering, and engineering technology. We are actually, our members are professional technical societies. And so their interest in us and why we exist is to make sure that when graduates finish with the programs, they go off and enter industry or wherever that they're ready to practice, okay? And so it was interesting when I was asked to join the panel today and come to the conference, because I'm not that much involved with competency-based education, but there's a lot of significant overlaps, I think, in the kind of things that we do with the competency-based approach. And so we look at the holistic view of the programs, and if it's interesting, if you go look at the ABET criteria for engineering, for example, it'll talk about mathematics appropriate to the discipline. Okay, that's all it says. It doesn't say how many credit hours you need, right? It doesn't say you have to have calculus and statistics or differential equations or anything like that. It just says mathematics appropriate to the discipline. So what we're allowing programs to do is to be innovative. Okay? Determine the competencies that they think their students are going to need and so forth, and allow them to build the programs the way that they need to be built. There's a couple things that I picked up from this morning, and Barbara did too, that sort of grate me just a little bit, is the whole stifling of innovation. I mean, I think, if anything, we have far exceeded and gone to the other extreme in trying to promote innovation. The students' experience, how programs are delivered, and so forth. Engineering, we have a long history. You said change is difficult. I couldn't agree more in many cases. ABET has a long history, 80 years of accrediting programs. Engineering programs, again, have been around a long time. We're comfortable, right, with certain types of structure and formats and so forth. And the first big test, I think, was the distance learning, the online experience. And people said there's no way you can accredit online engineering programs, primarily because of the laboratory experience. Right? You can learn some of the theory, you can take mathematics and maybe some of the sciences and so forth, but really the engineering and the laboratory experience. Well, I'm here to tell you that we have 9 programs now that are offered 100% online that are accredited by us. Our view is that, do these students, are they prepared to enter the profession? Can these programs prove they meet the criteria? We don't ask them, do you teach this online? We don't ask them, how many hours do you have the students sitting in the classroom? Okay? We're really interested in how they can meet the criteria and can they prove it. Just like in the New England Association, we're interested in evidence. And if you've ever been to one of their workshops, you'll hear that over and over again, evidence. So that's what we're interested in. Can you show to us how the students are learning? The other thing that we do that's that some people don't understand is we don't certify students per se, so we can't verify that each individual student will have this competency or have this ability to practice. We look at the programs and making the programs, helping them prepare the students.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things that I've done since I've left the department and joined the Center for American Progress is I went up to visit Sarah Lawrence University. And Sarah Lawrence is not inclined to use the word competency-based. They talk about capabilities of students. And one of the things that they're trying to drive towards is understanding exactly where all of their students are in developing the core capabilities that they want all of their graduates to have. And it's an example of a liberal arts college that is really trying to embrace this idea of competency-based learning, but being careful about using language that's appropriate to their institution. And one of the things that's been interesting as I've thought about engineering and other technological fields, they're used to their terminology too, and are changing the way we talk about things is it sometimes has to happen. And this analogy of online is also a critical one that. A lot of folks thought that when we begin to deliver education online, it would dramatically decrease the cost of delivering education. And most everybody who has looked at this says it doesn't work that way. And I have this sense that when we get to the end of the day, that direct assessment will also have the same problem, that it may be a better mode of delivery, one which gives us greater assurance that our students can do the things that we want them to do when they graduate, but it likely won't be one where it's dramatically cheaper. May cost more, may cost less, but there's going to be some substantial expenditure of resources to make that work. And I think our the way we have used credit hours is basically as a way to ration money, right? To allow the money to flow in a measured way out to supportive students. And so wasn't surprised when the Inspector General's report came out and raised as one of the core concerns that they have this issue of credit hours and the relationship between direct assessment and credit hours. Now, I'm the first to say that the credit hour was maybe not, I don't think was quite as magical as Barbara makes it out to be. Not all of the institutions and not all of the accreditors have a strong track record in that area. But I do think as we think about this credit hour equivalency as a rationing approach, a way to disperse the money, and the concerns that the IG raised, I was wondering if Barbara and David, could talk a bit about, what they think the appropriate response is, and how do we make some changes to the way that we, implement this process as a way to ensure that we're not at the end of the day having the Inspector General looking at particular institutions and assessing liabilities as they have in the past in a couple of cases.
I was on the negotiated rulemaking group that where the credit hour issue was raised, and my first reaction was, wait a minute, hang on here. Why would the department want to define the credit hour? That's academic, and there's like to think there's a bright line there, but came to understand it as a method of currency exchange. So the federal government awards financial aid based on how many credits a student takes per semester or term, and so it's currency exchange. And in fact, we have for years said to institutions when they award credit, they're printing money, as it were, academic money. So I think it'll be one of the things I noticed on the slide this morning was those skills that people were interested in. And one of them was, there was one, I think, on leadership, and there was one there on teamwork. And I used to teach 7th grade English, or tried to. And I was interested in teaching teamwork and some of those very same skills. And So part of the challenge with competencies is that we don't yet have a system that puts them into that framework. There's no currency exchange between credit hours and competencies. We don't know what level they are. We don't know how deep they are. We don't know how broad they are. And it'll be really interesting when we get far enough down there, and maybe somebody's done it, and if anybody knows it, I would like to see it, where people are actually lining up competency statements and particularly picking out some of these usual suspects like teamwork and saying, what do these look like in the different programs? And are we talking about the same thing? Are we handing the employer evidence that student who went through program A over here or a student who went to college C over there, are they the same thing? Calculus is pretty much the same thing, I think. I'm not sure English Lit is, but so we have a ways to go, I think.
Yeah, I would just add, so I mean, in the very sort of concrete, in the coming weeks soon, the department, as noted in the response to the Inspector General's report, is going to be putting out another Dear Colleague letter. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that process from credit hour, the credit hour conversion process. I think that there are different ways to think about it. I think the cleanest, easiest, most obvious one is that you just look at a course here and you say what the equivalent number of competencies is over there. And there's been, I think, some uncomfortableness in the field with that because that means that you have to already have a pre-existing course that you're just converting over, and it might stifle some sort of innovation if you have to do that direct mapping. I think we see it as not, you don't necessarily need to do it quite so directly. You can talk about an amount of learning that happens, and that would be what the competency is. But as Barbara was saying, and I think as David alluded to, we don't really have that much experience doing that, and we need to have better language, better vocabulary to figure out that equation. And this is where I get hopeful about just the proliferation of institutions doing this work. And as more people continue to do this, we'll have more examples, and we'll be able to look at them and say, this is a good way to do it, this one is maybe less so. And the other, I think, exciting convergence that's going on these days is technology. And as we get more assessments of student learning that utilize technology, we might be in a very different place for measuring student learning. And we certainly don't want to say, we don't want to have really boring, bad bubble tests that people are filling in online. That's not the way that assessment should go. But there are some really great simulation-based assessments. We saw some virtual reality assessments, landing a plane. Like if a student can land a plane in this simulator, you know that they really have the competencies. So can we bring that kind of simulation to other disciplines? There are some really exciting things that are happening, I think, that'll help us measure student learning differently. So with all of this innovation happening across the country and with this new technology, I think I'm hopeful that we're getting there.
So as we think about the where we are and how do we get from where we are to a place where there's much greater comfort with this. We heard in the last session particularly this notion that there are different segments of student populations that could benefit from this. Particularly the segment of higher education, which are the people who have left without a degree, and how do we think about the way that we bring those groups of students back into our higher education system in order for us to get to the places that we want to be at as a country in terms of educated population. I think clearly competency-based and direct assessment is a way to do that. And there was a role for, in that context, prior learning assessment as a part of this. And I was wondering, either or any of you, if you have some thoughts about how prior learning assessment fits into this. It's another area where the Inspector General raised concerns about it. I have a personal view, which is you can't do direct assessment well if you're not giving credit for prior learning, and if you're giving credit for prior learning, you're going to end up spending some financial aid for it, and whether you acknowledge it or not, that's part of buying into this whole notion of direct assessment. So wondering what anyone on the panel's thoughts are as it relates to this issue that of how do you appropriately deal with the issue of prior learning assessment.
Yeah, so prior learning assessment, I think, is something that the department also sees as a really potentially great way to do the things that David just mentioned. In fact, so we have our experimental sites that we just announced, and we have institutions that have applied for, and so we have both prior learning assessments and competency-based education ones. And I think it is a tricky balance to figure out the how you pay in one bucket for things that students have learned previously, and then how you also can pay separately for the learning that occurs at the institution when the student is enrolled. So I think that's something that we're going to be, hopefully, as the experiments roll out, studying very carefully. We have some evaluations that are going to be going on of those experiments to see exactly how it's done. And I think that's, for us, the sort of the safe space for innovation is you have these experiments that are running. And as I mentioned, there's some stuff that Southern New Hampshire and others are doing to try to get at that prior learning assessments and the remediation space. So I think that there's a lot of convergence there.
I think, just to be fair, the department has always paid for things that students already know. I mean, a student who takes French 2 when they should be taking French 4, or the student who sits through, Composition 1 who doesn't really need it, and you've paid for that. So this just kind of brings it out a little more visibly in a way. And I think just one other thing about the Southern New Hampshire proposal, and somebody here can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what they've said is to a student, if you can do this competency, demonstrate it now. So they have, one path rather than stepping back and saying, we're going to separately ask you to prepare a portfolio for prior learning assessment. They say, okay, go ahead and take the assessment. So it's in a way, it's a cleaner approach.
Yeah, so let me just say one thing I forgot to mention in my introduction. So ABET doesn't play any gatekeeping role for financial aid of any kind. So we don't provide that function, and so we're not so I guess ingrained with maybe some of the nuances of the credit hours and what that translates in terms of traditional financial aid dollars and so things like that. But we switched away from credit hours in the mid '90s for a great point in terms of really focusing on learning outcomes. Okay, what are engineers and computer scientists? What kind of skills do they have, and are they ready to practice? So really that focus was there. However, we didn't totally abandon credit hours because we looked to institutional accreditors to make sure that these programs are indeed legitimate programs and so forth. So we sort of put our faith and really tried to focus really on what are the skills and attributes that students should have and how do they demonstrate that. And I can tell you that the really difficult part is a lot of what we're talking about is assessment. And that was the biggest and most difficult change of all, was to get institutions and departments in our case really to focus on how to do assessment, because we went from the gamut of collect data on everything that any student's ever done on every student, and then try to make sense of it, to how can we intelligently and strategically build an assessment program so that we're looking at skills throughout the program. And I think that's part of the challenge with competency-based. For example, you touched on teamwork earlier. That's one of the criteria that we have. Students need to be able to work on teams, multidisciplinary teams, okay? And we leave that up to the institution to define what that looks like. But that's not done necessarily in a single course. In most cases, it's not done in a single course. It's done over a period or a series of courses, maybe starting in their freshman year or sophomore year and then finishing up, in their senior year. So a lot of those challenges, I think, with assessment are right there. I just did want to mention, though, that we've been actively supporting some programs in the U.S. That are focusing on transitioning veterans into some of the technical fields, engineering and computing. And I know San Diego State, I think it is one of the more active that I'm aware of. And what they're trying to do is, recruit and bring sailors, basically, from the San Diego naval bases into San Diego State and matriculate them into engineering and computing programs that aren't just, you don't have to start as freshmen necessarily. They can start somewhere in their mid-sophomore or whatever year, whatever makes sense, but they have to determine what are the competencies that these students, what skills do these students have. And so there's a number of different methods, different tools that they use to help assess the ability of these students to come in and have exposure to some of the, I guess, technical courses through, I don't know, maybe the nuclear operators and submarines or the communications people and whatnot. And so the assessment itself is difficult enough. The assessment on prior learning, I imagine, is probably even more so, because you can't do it in situ. You've got to do it. it's done after the fact.
And one of the things that always has been of interest to me, as we've talked about direct assessment and the competence-based learning, and thinking particularly about what's happened at institutions that have tried to move very dramatically in that direction, it really changes the role of faculty and really emphasizes to a much greater extent the faculty who are expert and proficient and leaders in assessment. And so I'm wondering, Michael, if you had some thoughts about how, as somebody who's observing this and not yet been approving under this, what your thoughts are about how the role of faculty is changing, and also, Barbara, your observations, having actually worked through this with the faculty, at University of Southern New Hampshire, who I know are very actively involved in helping think that their proposal through.
Okay, well, I guess I'll speak first. I can tell you from personal experience, actually part of my background is I was, for 6 years, I was an associate professor in electrical engineering, and so I taught that. And it was my first exposure to ABET, actually, because we went through our first ever computer engineering accreditation visit and so forth. So I got to learn ABET up close and personal, but from the other side of where I am now. And I guess the one thing that it really did in terms of the impact on faculty is it really changed our focus a bit. Because while we all want to make sure that students are learning the best, the best that they can, that they have the best experience and so forth, it really changed our view a little bit about what's the best way to do this, and how can I best understand whether or not the students are getting it. And if you teach a particular concept, and I don't know, maybe you determine that out of a class of 30, maybe only 17 are really proficient, then what's wrong? Is it me, the way I'm teaching? Is it not enough contact time? Do we need laboratory experiments? Do we need extra homework, computer simulations, whatever that is?
Better students.
Or better students. And that was, of course, that's the immediate thing. Of course, the students, are they sleeping in class or what? But I think it really changed my view. And also simple things like making up examinations, quizzes, whatnot. If you ask a problem, if it's not going to the learning outcomes, it's not going to what you're trying to get those students to achieve, why bother? Why bother constructing things? Just, we don't want to create busy time. We want to really focus on what the students are learning. And so I think there's a direct translation then if you're looking at competencies. What are those competencies that you want those students to have? And if you're not focused on those, then, you're not being effective.
So our commission has entered the process of revising its standards, and we're having meetings around the region. And if your institution is not sending somebody to one of those, sign up. We've got 4 left over the next couple of weeks. And some of the issues that are surfacing, one of them does revolve around the faculty. So if you read our standard on faculty, it's more or less written with full-time faculty in mind, with some allusions to part-time and adjunct faculty. So we know, let's set aside the problem of part-time and adjunct faculty for a minute and jump right again onto SNU, and they're deconstructing the roles of the faculty into different parts. And if we think about, let's pick on the English department today. If we pick on, think about these tables over here being the English department, and together they've come up with the English major, and they've decided what courses are required, what courses are offered, what should be in the courses. Maybe they even have objectives in the courses. They come together and construct it together. So they say by the time a student has completed all of this, we should be proud to put our name alongside theirs on the degree. And they assess the students. They get together and they talk about what have we learned from the assessments, and they use that to revise the courses and the program overall. So when you break that apart, and they advise the students, they have, even office hours for them. They know when they're having trouble. They know where they're struggling. And the same people assess them. They grade the papers and the tests and all of that, and they get all kinds of feedback along the way. You break that apart to different groups of people. And one question is, how do you bring it together? How do you bring the observations of the mentors with the coaches, with the assessors together, and use that information to improve the program? I think that's going to be really interesting to watch.
If I could just add, so you're getting to the heart of some of the challenges here is if you've dissembled the faculty role into many different parts, we have a requirement in the statute that says that there has to be, we have a requirement that says there has to be regular and substantive interaction with a faculty member. So if you've broken it into many different roles, you start to get into questions of if the student is interacting with someone that's not a full-time faculty member, is that okay? and then how far can you go down? And it starts to get into some really challenging questions, and especially, I was just talking about these wonderful simulations and these great things that really could assess what students know, but interacting with the simulator is not a faculty member. So you're sort of bumping up the side of me that's saying I really want these institutions to innovate and develop new things, are bumping up into some of the challenge or some of the regulations that we have in place today. So these are some of the issues that we're trying to figure out exactly where the line is now, where might the line be in the future, and how do you sort of thread that and encourage innovation, but also observe the laws that we have on the books now.
Oh, yeah, because I just had this momentary thought where, God forbid students interact with other students, and that be counted as instructional time, right? Sally, did you have a comment? I saw you react to something just a second ago. Right.
Right. Can I just say
Yes.
something related to that? If you think about somebody, had a friend who used to teach 500 students at a time in sociology 100. And so when he gave the final exam, he'd have all kinds of proctors there. He could have multiple versions of it, blah, blah, blah. But there was test security. But the idea was everybody took the same test at the same time. With direct assessment, everybody takes the assessment at a different time. So what's the version of multiple forms there? So you can land a plane, big plane, small plane, wind shears, rain. What is it? What is the item pool here? And how would you know? Right.
Yeah, I think that I have to agree with Sally that you think about how much has changed in terms of the use of instructional designers as an example of the transformative change that we've all seen over the last decade as we move more and more of our education content online. I think that this notion of assessment and the importance and power of assessment is a wave of this. I do think that this question about how do students really learn, right? Who do they learn from? Do they learn more from faculty members, or do they learn more from peers? Really calls into question a lot of the basic underpinnings of our educational system and the way in which we have constructed it to finance it, which by the way, really reflects the way the world was like in the 1950s. Maybe in the 1970s if we're really optimistic about it, but it really is rooted in a very different time and place, which we've got to think about how we move beyond that. And it's not just about credit hours. It's not just about roles of faculty. It's about the whole enterprise. And I think we are at the cusp of some really remarkable things, but it's going to be it's going to be concerning and frightening to some folks. David, I will say that a couple of months before I left the department, I was, being in one of my very optimistic moods, and I said that actually at a Gates convening of all things, somebody said, what will the higher education landscape look like in a decade? And I said, very blissfully, somebody posited that it would be a mix of competency-based and credit-based educational programs. And I said, I hope not. I hope in a decade we've figured this out enough so everything was done in a competency-based way. I challenge David and Barbara and Michael as we close out to say where they would hope that we are, maybe not in a decade, but in 20 years in terms of the way that we're delivering education and whether or not they see direct assessment and competency-based as playing some particular role, beneficial role, in broader ways than is today.
Yeah, this is, my own personal sort of thought of what the future looks like is that students really have the capacity, and we're starting to see it now, to learn from many, many different places, not just one person who sits in front of them, that they have like lots and lots of different learning options. There's lots of different ways that they can have that learning assessed in really robust and exciting ways that they can present to other employers or whoever else society down the road what they've learned, and then it'll probably be reassembled into, in some cases, degrees, but in other cases, badges or certificates or other smaller chunks that maybe they design it themselves and they say, this is, I want to have a learning experience that looks like this, or there might be some that are more sort of standard and default, but a lot more student freedom to choose what they want to study and how to assess it, but also having the confidence in what the students have learned so that they can present that to others. And I think that what we're doing today with competency-based education and direct assessment is laying the groundwork for a lot of that and giving us the proof points that we can start or continue the innovation, but it's going to be leading to a lot more stuff.
David Bergeron, long before you or I got to the University of Rhode Island, they had a traditional campus in Kingston, residential. It's a land grant, so of course it was out on the farm. And in Rhode Island, the farms are about as big as that table.
Yeah,
I
they
think.
are.
So, and then in the late 60s, early 60s, they opened up an office in Providence, which is now called the College of Continuing Education of the Providence campus. Originally, it was CEW, Continuing Education for Women. And all these adult women who had not completed degrees or maybe not started degrees came, and so there was something different going on. And I think, looking ahead, I think that's what competency-based ed is. It's gonna be a different track, just like we have different ways to read books now. We're gonna have different paths, and they spill over and influence each other. And that's where I think we're going.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I would agree with Barbara a bit. I think, and David too, in terms of diversity, I think diversity is important. It plays a great role in many things. And I guess where I like, what I'm comfortable with in ABET and the way we do business is we don't really, I shouldn't say we don't care, but we don't put a premium on this particular method or that particular method. And like adult learning and everything else that goes into assessment and all kinds of things, it's evolutionary. There's lots of things that are happening. And I think it's exciting, certainly an exciting time to see what happens, especially in technology, because you had mentioned ABET actually accredits programs in 28 countries. And one of the reasons that we do that is because there is such excitement and such demand, and people want to improve the quality of their lives and their nations and so forth. And they see the surest way to do that is through increasing their technology as fast as they can. And so it's great for tools, as you mentioned earlier, and for assessing capabilities and so forth. So I think it's a combination of all these things. I don't know what the future will hold, but I'm pretty confident that in terms of ABET, what we'll be focused on again is just making sure whatever those professions look like in the future, that we're there to make sure that the students are graduating are ready to enter them.
Can I say just a word about ABET? As I understand it, one reason ABET has gone to so many different countries is employers in Turkey who want to hire a mechanical engineering graduate from a Turkish institution want to know what they're getting. And they want that engineer to be comparable to a graduate of an American ABET. So if that isn't competency-based ed,
Yep.
it clearly is. It's worked.
It clearly is, and it has worked. So with that, I want you to thank our panelists and